The lunch was already waiting when I arrived: seared salmon, a bottle of Sancerre, cloth napkins folded into origami cranes. My mother had outdone herself. That was always the tell: the more elaborate the table, the more serious the ambush. She'd done the same for the intervention about my apartment, the one about my car, and the long Sunday brunch in 2019, during which my father gently suggested that a master's degree was never really off the table. I had learned to read her tablescapes the way sailors read weather. "We just want to understand," she said before I'd even set down my bag. She was wearing the expression she reserved for board meetings at the Garden Society: controlled concern, the kind that doubles as a verdict. My father sat at the far end with his reading glasses still on, which meant he'd rehearsed his lines and wanted to look studious delivering them. My brother Daniel lounged to his left, jacket slung over his chair, the practiced ease of a man who'd never once doubted that rooms were arranged around him. Daniel had made partner at Whitmore Capital 2 years ago. He wore it the way some people wear a title belt, constantly, even when no one was watching. To be fair to him, he'd earned it. He was good at what he did, and what he did was legible. People could watch him do it. Quarterly reviews, client dinners, public wins. The architecture of traditional success is, above all, visible. We thought it was time, my father began, to have an honest conversation about the consultancy. The consultancy. That was what they called it, the way you'd call a child's finger painting the artwork. I had been running Verada Analytics for 5 years. 5 years of building something that most people in that industry were only just beginning to understand existed. "You've always been the thoughtful one," my mother added. She meant it kindly, the way people mean it when they're explaining why you'd be better suited for a quieter life. But thoughtful and sustainable are different things, sweetheart. Especially without a safety net. Daniel leaned forward. "There's an opening at Whitmore. Mid-level research analyst. It's not glamorous, but it's a foundation." He said foundation the way contractors say it, like I'd been building on sand. "You'd have benefits. Stability. People to learn from." He paused, and I could see him selecting the next thing carefully, the way you choose a tool. "I've already put in a word. They know your analytical background. They're open to it." That was meant to feel like generosity. I understood that. He believed it was. I looked at the salmon. I thought about the encrypted email sitting in my drafts folder, the one I'd be sending in 3 hours. I thought about the 7-figure licensing agreement we'd signed on Tuesday, and the profile that Meridian Business Review had been sitting on for 2 weeks, scheduled to publish at 4 o'clock that afternoon. I thought about my operations director, Priya, who had texted me at 7 this morning. "All systems go. Press embargo lifts at 4. "That's generous," I said. "I'll think about it, Nadia." My father took off his glasses. "I don't think you're hearing us." I was hearing them perfectly. I had been hearing them for 5 years, at Thanksgiving, at my cousin's wedding, in careful voicemails. What they were describing every time was a version of me that was smaller and more comprehensible. What they had never described was the version that actually existed. Daniel's phone buzzed. He silenced it without looking. "The research space you're in," he said, "is extremely competitive. The firms that survive have institutional backing. They have relationships. They have infrastructure," I offered. "Exactly. Do you have that?" I thought about our infrastructure. The proprietary modeling system we'd spent 3 years developing, the one our lead engineer, Marcus, had described to a potential investor as the kind of thing that takes a decade to build and a month to become indispensable. The data partnerships with 4 of the largest logistics networks in North America, signed under NDAs tight enough that even our own advisors didn't know the full picture until 6 months in. The pending acquisition of a smaller rival that would close, pending regulatory sign-off, in 6 days, and that would make Verada the only firm in our category with coast-to-coast operational data at the granularity our clients actually needed. I thought about the fact that Whitmore Capital was one of our clients, a detail I had not shared, because they'd signed their own NDA, and I saw no reason to complicate my mother's salmon lunch. Their head of research had emailed Priya last month to say the modeling outputs had changed the way his team thought about a particular sector. Priya had forwarded it to me without comment, which was her way of saying something significant. "I'm managing," I said. My mother refreshed my water glass. "We just don't want you to wake up at 40 and realize you've been too proud to ask for help." "I know," I said. "Thank you." At 3:58, I excused myself to the bathroom. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. Simple gray blazer. No jewelry. The same outfit I'd been photographed in 2 weeks ago. And I thought about all the versions of this lunch I'd sat through. All the gentle corrections. All the concern that felt somehow more comfortable than curiosity. I washed my hands. I went back to the table. At 4:03, all three of their phones lit up at once. I watched it happen. My mother frowned at her screen. My father put his glasses back on. Daniel went very still in a way I hadn't seen before. A kind of recalibrating stillness, like a compass needle swinging to find north. I noticed his jaw shift, the small mechanical adjustment that happens when a person's working model of a situation stops fitting the facts. The headline was clean. Verada Analytics closes 340 men Series C. Nadia Osei named to Meridian's 40 under 40 in private intelligence. The subheading read, "The quietly built firm now holds data partnerships no competitor has matched." "This is Daniel started." "Yes," I said. My mother looked up. For the first time in the meal, she wasn't managing her expression. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was a fair question. I'd thought about it, actually. I'd thought about it many times over 5 years. The version of this story in which I'd offered updates, shared milestones, invited them into the narrative as it was building. I'd imagined it clearly. And I'd imagined just as clearly how those updates would have been received, with worry, with alternative suggestions, with the careful, well-intentioned pressure to manage my expectations. I'd thought about one specific dinner, 4 years ago, when I'd mentioned in passing that we'd signed our first enterprise contract, and my father had nodded and asked if I was still keeping my options open. I had decided then that open-endedness was the safer policy. "I didn't think it would land the same way," I said. Coming from me, my father set down his fork. He was quiet for a long time. "Whitmore Capital," he finally said. "Are they a client? They signed with us in March." Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He pushed back from the table slightly. Just a few inches. Just enough. The next 2 days were their own kind of weather. My mother called 7 times, each message in a slightly different key, pride, disbelief. Something that edged toward apology without quite arriving. She mentioned twice that she'd always felt I had a particular kind of focus, which was the family's way of retroactively endorsing something they'd previously coded as stubbornness. My aunt sent a congratulatory text that managed to imply she'd always known. Daniel called once late on the second evening, and left no message. I didn't call him back. I figured he needed a few more days to work out what he actually wanted to say. And I had no interest in a conversation assembled from whatever came first. Priya sent me the press coverage in a running thread. 31 outlets in the first 6 hours. The Meridian profile alone drove 40,000 unique visitors to our site before midnight. 2 competing firms reached out about partnership discussions. One sent flowers. On the 3rd day, my grandfather called. He was 81, sharp as a tack, and the only person in the family who had ever asked me, in plain language, what I was actually building and why. He'd called me the month I launched Verada to say he thought the market was ready for it. He hadn't hedged. He hadn't suggested I keep my options open. He'd said, with the mild certainty of someone who has watched enough cycles to know which direction water runs, "The timing is right and you understand it. Don't wait for permission." I had kept that voicemail for 2 years before I finally let it expire. "I've been watching the numbers," he said. "You did it right, I tried to. Your father's coming around. Give him a week, a pause. Your brother is going to need longer. I know. That's not a criticism of him. It's just the truth. He built something real too. He just built it in a place where everyone could see him building it." Another pause. "You built yours in the dark. That's harder. Also lonelier." It was, sometimes, I said. There were nights, specifically I was thinking of a particular November 2 years in, When two of our early data partners had renegotiated terms simultaneously, and I'd spent a week recalculating runway on a spreadsheet while eating cereal for dinner, when the loneliness was less of an abstraction. He laughed, dry and brief. Well, the lights are on now. I thought about that on the morning the Series C formally closed, standing at the window of our new office, which occupied the 14th floor of a building we'd signed a 7-year lease on the previous spring, 2 blocks from the co-working space where I'd spent the first 18 months of this company working at a shared table next to a man who recorded podcasts about cryptocurrency and once ate a hard-boiled egg so loudly I lost the thread of a client call. The analyst position at Whitmore was still technically open. I thought about the lunch and the salmon, and my brother's face in the moment the phones went off, the reorientation happening in real time behind his eyes. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. There was no particular rush of vindication, no moment of dramatic symmetry snapping into place. What I felt was quieter than that, more like relief, or maybe just recognition. A long thing had finished, and a different long thing was beginning, and the two of them were only related because I had lived through both. My mother asked 2 weeks later if she could share the Meridian profile at her garden society. I said yes. She posted it with a caption that described her daughter as always driven, which was perhaps its own kind of revision, a quiet rewriting of the record, but a gentle one, and I decided to leave it there uncontested. My brother called again 3 weeks after the announcement. He was direct, which I respected. He said he'd spent some time with the Meridian piece and the follow-on coverage, and he wanted to understand the data partnership structure better. Not for Whitmore. For himself. We talked for an hour. It was the first conversation we'd had in years that didn't feel like a negotiation over something unnamed. I kept the photo from the original shoot, gray blazer, no jewelry, the same unremarkable outfit I'd worn to the lunch, framed on the wall beside my desk. Not as a monument to anything. Just as a reminder that a thing can be real before anyone else sees it. That visibility and validity are not the same thing, even though the world spends a great deal of energy suggesting they are. The question I've been turning over since the lunch, the one I can't quite put down: how much of what we build gets shaped, quietly and permanently, by the audience we imagine watching us? And what might we become? What might any of us become, if we finally stopped building for them?